of international relations, one of the biggest questions the United States and the rest of the world has had to deal with is what to do about international organizations, specifically the UN. Following World War II, the UN was created in an attempt to provide some organization that could monitor conflict, keep the peace, and also help the world achieve global development. Now, looking backwards about 70 years later, we're still trying to figure out exactly what to do with the United Nations and maybe how to fix it. Today on our broadcast, I have three students. From my right to my left, Sierra McGinnis, Joseph Lowe, and Jacob Lee. Jacob is having some audio difficulties today, so he may be communicating through one of his two colleagues via text message or instant messenger. So today, panelists, as you know, we're here to talk about the United Nations and maybe what can be done to make the UN work a little bit more efficiently. For the viewers who may not be as familiar with it, what exactly is the United Nations and what was it created to do?
Well, the United Nations is an international intergovernmental organization. Its headquarters, or its main headquarters, are located in New York City. As you mentioned, it was formed with the goal of promoting peace, security, and cooperation amongst different countries. It came into being in 1945, right after the Second World War. And 51 countries agreed to join it then, but obviously as time continued, more countries have joined it. Now, currently, the main missions of the United Nations are to maintain peace and security, obviously, but they also promote sustainable development. They work to protect human rights, maintain international laws, as well as deliver humanitarian aid when necessary.
Right, and looking at not the UN's origin really, but how the idea got started. So Woodrow Wilson was the first person to propose a global organization and founded the League of Nations during and after World War II, around 1917, 1918, and that organization failed. Yeah, so it was we saw the United Nations as a result of World War II to, and as Jacob is inputting here, that to ensure that we didn't see the massive destruction and genocide that we saw in World War II.
Has it been successful at accomplishing its goals? What do you think?
Yes and no. Jacob says no, but
apparently really emphatic no as well.
Yes. Yes. They do a good job of marketing that they're a peacekeeping, peace-building organization. But you see the conflicts in Africa with genocide and conflicts in the Middle East, and are they really being effective? And I think that they could be a little bit more effective than what they are.
Well, in fairness to the United Nations, so what liberals would claim, I suppose, is that the mandate of the United Nations was actually to try to avoid international conflict between countries, to prevent things like the American attack on Hiroshima or the Allied firebombing of Dresden. But if you were to instead compare it to something like Vietnam, which is basically an internal conflict that outside actors got involved in, Syria, an internal conflict that outside actors got involved in, the genocide in Rwanda, or in Yugoslavia, which again are state-level actors, and what's happening internally. If you limit the goal of the UN, do you think that you can at least kind of forgive it for avoiding another World War I or another World War II or some other kind of international conflict?
You can definitely see where the UN has been effective in containing conflicts. So they may not, and that's true too, their goal may not be to eradicate and stop wars because, as we all can realize, war is an inevitable part of life and conflict in general. But they do a good job of containing conflicts.
And I feel like, too, if there are any major international conflicts or anything like that, such as Iraq invading Kuwait or any other situation, really, with the United Nations and the different countries that are involved, they're very quick to jump in, as Jacob is mentioning, to kind of jump in and end that really quickly. It's not like it begins and progresses for a long time. We do see countries wanting to get involved, whether it's through diplomatic relations or even military intervention, things like that. That does occur over time and like throughout time, especially now. We see a lot of civil wars. We see the problems in Syria, things like that. Everyone is quick to, well, seemingly quick to want to help and want to aid in that issue and try to resolve that. In terms of the United Nations, however, there are different councils. You have like the Security Council, you have the Human Rights Council, things like that. And there are issues in terms of like functionality and efficiency that a lot of people are kind of bringing to the limelight, whether they've always been there or if we're just trying to fix the things now. Yeah, there are issues now. Sorry, I'm struggling with what I'm trying to say. There are issues that are very prevalent now with the United Nations that
For
people
the
are trying to fix.
for the viewers at home, again, Jacob is having some difficulty with his audio, and so there's a small conversation on as a sidebar about whether or not the United Nations is involved in trying to regulate international treaties in outer space. You could also think about Antarctica, basically territories that had not been claimed. How do you divide up territory on the moon, things like that. And so I think that's what they were trying to sort out, was whenever you said space, what exactly were they referring to? So, so thinking then about, so clearly the United Nations appears to be pretty decent at some things, like trying to prevent a global international crisis, maybe not so good at other things like domestic problems. So what then do you think are the reasons why the United Nations has been ineffective in dealing with civil war or other domestic disputes? Maybe what are some of the things that need to be done to try and alleviate some of these problems? What do you guys think?
I feel like, first of all, before they could even go in and try to alleviate any problems within other countries, the United Nations should probably kind of focus on their internal issues. For example, the Security Council. You see, like the 5 permanent members of that council, so China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the U.S., there's a bit of almost like a power struggle, I guess. They kind of have more power, more leeway than others in the United Nations. And so the unequal representation kind of causes a lot of issues and conflict that like the lesser countries, the inferior ones or the ones that feel inferior, they want to become a permanent part or like kind of gain that residency, and we don't really see that. We see their struggles, and we see like the issues with transparency and, as I mentioned, the membership issues, or even the power of veto, which like the P5 has, but the rest of them don't. I feel like those issues should probably first be, they need to be handled before a lot of other countries see it beneficial to go into other countries, because there is a lot of conflict there. For instance, like African countries, Latin American countries, like they want to have a permanent residency on the council, but with the P5, it's kind of not happening. There's not that connection.
But if you were to look at adding additional members, permanent members to the council, which countries would you consider? You know, so you You mentioned the United States, Great Britain, and France as being the three major industrial Western powers. Would you add another industrial power? If you mentioned China and Russia, are there other actors in the world that you might think of as having the same size or international gravitas as a China or a Russia that would be added? Who would you put on there?
Well, as Jacob said, Japan is definitely a vital force in the world as far as their economy and military capacity as well. I would think that Germany, while their power has been drastically decreased since World War II, maybe a France or Spain. Other countries are part of the European Union.
Sorry. I feel like we would need to make sure that Europe isn't necessarily overrepresented on this council. I know that's like one big issue a lot of people are kind of bringing up, that they feel that Asian countries are underrepresented, but European countries are overrepresented. And then just, as I said, like the African countries and Latin American countries don't really even have a presence at all. You see these large areas, like the industrialized areas and everything, but I know like smaller countries like Costa Rica or Jordan or whatever, they're wanting their own presence too, their own representation, because you do see the powerhouses, and then you have smaller countries that maybe like they have their own power, they can make their own decisions to do whatever, but like they're advocating for transparency, they're advocating for change, and obviously the larger countries are not wanting that, or else it would have already been in effect. So we kind of have to make sure that like a bullying effect doesn't really continue if we were to add more countries onto this.
What kind of criteria would you use to determine what countries you would add? I mean, so you had suggested, for example, that you don't want to overrepresent Europe, which already has 2 or 3 members, depending on how you count Russia. Maybe Africa and Latin America are underrepresented. Do you allocate permanent seats to parts of the world? One of the things that Jacob's mentioning is that maybe a country like Turkey, or even maybe in Malaysia or Indonesia, do you try to make sure that there's a Muslim country rather than having 4 Christian countries and 1 Buddhist country? What kind of a balance would you want to use?
Well, the purpose of the UN, I mean, you got to look at it. Is it to provide a balance, or is it to just keep the peace? And do you need some sort of balanced representation to do that? I think it is good to have that balance, though. With there are a lot of Christian and I guess industrial countries, as we've mentioned. But as far as Jacob has mentioned, India or Brazil, as far as looking at a powerhouse in Latin America, I would view maybe Brazil or an Argentina, some countries that have not a thriving economy, but a sustainable one, and one that isn't as dependent as others. Countries that don't really have a powerful voice in the global community, places like that.
What are the points another point that Jacob is making on the sidebar chat is that maybe thinking about adding countries either that were not involved in World War II, or maybe adding a couple of countries that didn't exist prior to World War II. So India, a country that's been mentioned a couple of times, that wasn't a country during World War II, it was a colony. Turkey, which was sort of a quasi-protectorate at the time, also might make sense. Maybe some of the African countries, like South Africa, that was not a country, but rather a colony during World War II. Doesn't that make sense? Another thing is that we talked about this idea of the permanent members that always have a place on the council. One of the things that we really didn't mention, or we just kind of buzzed over it, was this idea that the permanent members also have veto power on the Security Council. Is the real problem that 5 countries are always on the UN Council, or is it those 5 countries have effective veto over Security Council decisions? We'll talk about that for a second.
Well, I think Jacob is agreeing that the whole power, if I'm understanding correctly, that the whole power of veto needs to be changed. That we need to allow other countries to come in and have that veto, even if it was kind of like a cycle almost, because you see some countries, they come in, it changes, and then they kind of exit. But where the P5 has so much power, including this power of veto, a lot of countries are getting angry about that, because it's almost like they're forming that, almost like a block, and kind of like they're seeing this chance to kind of be in an alliance within the United Nations. They're the larger country, or they're predominantly larger. They can kind of affect, like they can help determine what happens, who does what, when the UN gets involved, things like that. And personally, I think that, in my opinion, I don't think that they should necessarily be the dominant permanent 5 now, given that times are changing and there are different values and ideas kind of being thrown around. Maybe it is time for change, honestly, just to kind of see what happens next.
What do you think, Mr. Lowe? The Security Council veto, do you think that needs to be reformed? Would reforming make a difference?
I definitely think that something needs to change. As Jacob's mentioning, if the same 5 countries keep the power, it doesn't really matter what the other countries think. And while there may be arguably a good balance between what they decide and what they do, I don't think that it's good for 5 countries to have that power all the time, and the opinions of the smaller countries and the will of smaller countries needs to be better represented.
Can you think of any specific examples of problems that maybe were not addressed because of veto power? I mean, after all, veto power is only important if it's important. It only matters if it matters, right? So can you give some examples of when one of the major powers having veto prevented the UN from acting where maybe it needed to?
So you look at one that hits close to home for many Americans, the example of 9/11 and us wanting to invade Iraq and Iran, Afghanistan, have an increased presence in the Middle East. I think that the UN definitely I don't know exactly which countries were involved in making the decision at the time, but I know that the UN decided not to provide much assistance in that our choice to invade the Middle East.
And certainly, when you think about the Second Persian Gulf War, even within our own normal NATO alliance, Germany was opposed to the invasion. Some of the other NATO countries were. Turkey was opposed to the invasion, actually voted to prevent us from joining, from using military bases on their territory. But I don't know, maybe the current conflict in Syria would be handled differently if Russia or China didn't have a veto. Maybe how Israel is dealt with would be a little bit different if the United States couldn't veto attempts to punish Israel for perceived infractions against the Palestinians that live in the West Bank or in Gaza Strip. Both of those might be something to think about. So moving on from the Security Council as being an area of reform, another one of the things that Ms. McGinnis mentioned earlier in the show was the Human Rights Council as being one of the wings of the United Nations. What exactly happens with the Human Rights Council, and why has it become so controversial in the last, I don't know, 15 or 20 years?
Well, they're a body that's responsible for strengthening the, I guess, like the promotion and the protection of human rights globally. That act's kind of vague, and that's what kind of causes a lot of controversy. For instance, what United States citizens might see as a human rights violation could possibly be culturally accepted in another country. So it's kind of like the United Nations has to figure out where those boundaries are, like, and see, can they do anything? We do have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but whether or not countries accept that document or not kind of is up to them. Um, Pretty much the legitimacy of this council is questioned a lot. Kind of, can they really do anything? Um, there are different international agreements saying what we can and can't do, just like the Declaration of Human Rights. And Jacob was mentioning that one big issue is that countries don't have to accept it, and that's a really, like, that causes a lot of problems. So is it that they don't want to, or they don't want to be a part of that because certain countries are, or what exactly is it? There are a lot of people that don't necessarily respect it. They don't see the document as important, I guess. Kind of goes to a self-interest thing. If someone's telling you not to do something, but you're doing it anyway because you want to, then you might not want to.
Well, would a country like the United States have objections to the Human Rights Council? Would a country like Canada have objections to the Human Rights Council? Countries in Central and Latin America, is that where the objection is? I mean, when you say people don't have to listen to the Commission or they don't have to observe the Universal Declaration, why would that really be a UN problem as opposed to a problem with that specific country? Does that make sense?
I think I understand. Well, I mean, if a country's not respecting it, but they're a part of the United Nations, then that's obviously going to the influence there, I guess, within the United Nations. If it's a country that has a lot of influence and they're not respecting it, then perhaps another country's like, oh, well, if they're not doing that, then I don't have to do that either. Or if you see a lot of gang activity or even like terrorism acts, a lot of those are human rights violations. But if different countries don't view them as violations, then what happens next? Like, does an outside actor need to come in and fix that, or is it the UN's job? That kind of thing.
Mr. Lowe, what do you think? The problems of the Human Rights Council, is there anything that can be done maybe to make it more effective, or at least maybe to provide a little bit more legitimacy? Actually, I think it looks like Mr. Lowe might have just gotten dropped from the broadcast. So we'll go ahead and come back to the Human Rights Council in just a second. So what about, we had already discussed that it appears the UN really is only capable of international conflict. Do you think that we should investigate turning it into something that has a greater role in domestic peacekeeping? Or do you think that really we need to leave the mandate as is and focus on international conflict?
So are you asking if we should focus on like domestic issues or just international?
Well, because we had mentioned before that it appears to be effective on international issues, less effective when we're talking about domestic issues. Does there need to be any reform that would allow the United Nations greater latitude to act domestically and target actors? What kinds of reforms would be necessary if we wanted them to get more active in maybe stopping genocide in a country or preventing civil war? Or should we just leave it the way that it is?
Jacob is saying that we need to leave it as it is because there are already a lot of issues with sovereignty nowadays. For instance, if the United Nations were to get more involved or directly involved, then there could be more resistance from those governments, and they might be less likely to want to be a part of the United Nations. It might cause a lot of issues in terms of communication, or it kind of goes back to that respect thing. Um, Basically, he's saying to leave it. I'm agreeing with him. I think that there are boundaries in place for a reason. While the United Nations, I feel like even if we gave them power to directly go into it, would they do that? Um, they claim to be peace building or peacemaking, but if they have direct control within domesticated areas, would that build peace? Would that maintain peace, or would that just cause more conflict and even maybe more military intervention or something like that? I think that it would probably cause a lot of more conflict and even a cutting of ties between different countries. Maybe not like the permanent five necessarily, because they do have so much power within the United Nations, but possibly the smaller countries and the different blocks in the world might start to kind of turn on each other even more.
Right, and just to reiterate what Jacob's saying, you you see an organization whose main mission is peace, and going in and involving yourself in countries, domestic governments who may not want you to be there, and it really kind of would add stress, having a third party actor in the middle of things trying to mediate. It could increase tensions or cause more an increased escalation of violence and that sort of thing. So again, just to reemphasize what Sierra was saying, it's the UN has a mission of peace, and if they are to come and get involved, it could have the adverse effect and cause more conflicts.
Another question that comes up a lot with the UN is the issue of corruption. Probably the most famous UN corruption scandal was the Iraqi oil for food program that was in place prior to the second Persian Gulf War, that had been implemented as a way of punishing Iraq for the first Gulf War and its invasion of Kuwait, and then as a way of trying to control the Iraqi government. For our viewers at home who may not know, what exactly was the Oil for Food program, and what went wrong with the program?
So basically, what Iraq was doing at the time was obviously they have a surplus of oil, and that's their main export natural resource that they have. But they're in the desert, and they don't have a lot of land to irrigate and farm and that sort of thing. So they lack different resources such as food and medicine. And what they did during this period was they were selling oil for other resources, so basically like bartering back and forth between other countries who had things that they needed and gave them oil in exchange for that.
So then what went wrong with the Oil for Food program that ultimately led to allegations of corruption?
I can't remember exactly what transpired that made it look like the UN was involved. I do know that it was sketchy, the agreements that Iran was making with other countries, but I don't know to what extent that happened.
It was prior to the invasion. during the Bush administration. It was actually right when the corruption scandal was just beginning to break, and where the West, or maybe popular Western media, was first really paying attention to how the Oil for Food program was being managed and how exactly the money was being used. Ms. McGinnis, do you have maybe any input into the Oil for Food program and kind of what happened there?
Well, I'm looking at an article on The Economist at the moment, and it said that due to inefficiency and corruption among those involved, including the United Nations staff at their headquarters, it said that there was a issue in which Saddam Hussein, his regime, was on the rise, and they they got almost $10 billion from this program. Um, a lot of people said it was due to corruption within the United Nations, or like the Security Council didn't do enough to. They had placed sanctions in place, but maybe they didn't hold those accountable or didn't further explore those. There's a lot of allegations in terms of corruption, although there's not any. This is saying there's not any concrete evidence of what exactly happened. But basically, it was a lot of mixed signals or even wrong signals being sent between countries. And a lot of people are blaming the Security Council for it falling apart and for money kind of getting into the wrong hands and allowing like conflict to further ensue because of it.
Jacob has actually provided sort of some detail into what was actually going on. Joseph, do you want to go ahead and kind of walk us through what Jacob has been providing?
Sure. So Sierra was mentioning, rich people were benefiting from a program that was meant to benefit people in need. But what Jacob's actually putting on the little sidebar here is the companies that sold commodities for the Oil for Food program were overcharging the prices by up to 10%. And the overcharge that they were getting from that was being diverted into accounts that help benefit regime leaders such as Saddam Hussein at the time.
It sounds almost like just a good old-fashioned money laundering scheme, where I have dirty money on the one hand and I need to clean the money somehow, and so I negotiate with somebody who has goods or services and they provide me a little bit of a kickback on the side. Is that really as simple as that?
On the surface, that's what it seems to be. Saddam Hussein and the political leaders in Iran at the time were benefiting from this program that was, on the surface looked like it was helping people in need, but actually it was funding a political machine that was actually hurting the people that it was meant to help.
Now, turning a little bit more domestic, the United Nations has certainly been one of the favorite whipping boys for American politicians, particularly for conservatives or right-wingers within the United States. What have been some of the accusations that have come out of the far right of American politics, and are any of these accusations accurate?
Well, just kind of going back to the whole 9/11 thing, many Republicans were upset with the UN because obviously terrorists in the Middle East did us an extreme injustice, and we wanted to retaliate, but the UN was not backing that. So many Republicans were very upset with the UN and called it inefficient and ineffective, and its purpose was not being served as peacekeeping, which I'm not sure how valid that argument is when we were seeking to start a war. But anyway,
There's a certain amount of irony for saying that an organization designed to keep the peace wasn't helping us go and fight people.
Right. Yeah.
I do understand your point.
Yeah.
Anything else? Anything beyond the specific case of our attempt our successful attempt to invade Iraq in 2002, 2003?
Well, you look at, the recent talks of President Obama recently attended climate change summit in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And as we all know, Republicans either don't believe in global warming or think that all the studies and all that are composed of imaginary data, and so it's kind of difficult for Republicans to support an organization that is seeking to limit and restrict things like coal and natural gas and things like that, when Republicans are obviously pushing for those things, and we're in a state whose main resource is coal.
Have there been any allegations coming from the right, either that the United Nations somehow compromises American sovereignty, or that maybe the United Nations has a hidden anti-American agenda? Anything like that I might hear if I were to, I don't know, watch Fox News for a little while?
I don't think so. I mean, it's one of those things that Republicans are pretty set in their ways when they want. If they hear something that opposes what they think, it's one of those things where they just kind of shut down on the most part, or retaliate with some.
Well, they are Americans after all. That's what we do.
Right. My way or the highway.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know. I think Republicans as a whole and conservatives have a difficult time seeing the big picture and how we are all involved in this global community, and which the UN serves a good purpose, but being a Republican myself, I support the UN's ideas, but its effectiveness at times I would like to call into question over certain things. But
I think a big issue with right wings and the United Nations, Jacob had mentioned, or is mentioning some different things, and I've been thinking about it as well. People, generally speaking, don't like to be clout on things, and there was a Human Rights Committee meeting, and the United Nations pretty much called out the U.S. on human rights abuses that we've had. So if that's things that we've done at Guantanamo, or even drone strikes, or our acceptance of the death penalty, gun violence, things like that, even racial inequality. Like, we have this long list of issues that have we've compiled over the years. And so, I mean, if you look at the right wing, you see a lot of individuals who are kind of accepting of military advancements and intervention and things like that. And so the United States has done a lot of things, and I feel like perhaps that's why maybe more conservative individuals don't like the United Nations, is because the UN is actually bringing to light all of the things that we've done, and we kind of either have to take ownership of that or just kind of let them think what they want.
You guys may be a little bit too young to remember this, but back in the early 1990s, Jesse Helms, who was a Republican senator from North Carolina, was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and actually withheld America's contributions to the United Nations because the UN supported family planning, including the distribution of condoms and paying for abortions in many third world countries. And of course, that's before your time and maybe the time of many of our viewers as well. What about allegations that the United Nations is anti-Israel, or that it's anti-Semitic, or that somehow it has an agenda to destroy the state of Israel that was created after World War II. Do you think there's any evidence to suggest that as well?
Personally, I'm not familiar enough with the UN's agenda and what all they've done and their presence in the Middle East. I know obviously that they are kind of skittish with their involvement in the Middle East and things like that. As Jacob's saying, South Africa is a country that was established after World War II too, and they aren't doing anything to really hinder that with the apartheid and all that. They offered their support, and I don't know. I think the relations in the Middle East are obviously date back thousands of years, and conflicts and religious ties. And I don't know, as far as keeping the peace, as we mentioned earlier, if the UN gets involved, it could escalate a conflict that's so it's dangerous playing with a cocked gun.
Ms. McGinnis, what do you think? Are there any evidence to suggest that the United Nations might be anti-Israel or anti-Israeli policy?
I think there are different things that have kind of happened in the past, whether possibly anti-Semitic propaganda was handed out, or different issues like over time have kind of accumulated. But I think it's important to recognize that it could be a mutual feeling. I'm looking at a Pew Research poll right now, and it says that Israel, they're one of the most unsupporting countries out there for the United Nations. It says about 70% of the country, according to this poll, doesn't support them. And obviously for obvious reasons, if they feel like they're being attacked or things like that. Yeah, there have been issues with propaganda or different instances of racism that have kind of happened throughout history. There's a lot of a built-up resentment over time, and I think a lot of people have seen that possibly in the media, or even it could have been there's a lot of stuff that hasn't been shown in the media that we do or other countries do. So basically, yeah, there's a lot of stuff ever since World War II, ever since the Holocaust, everything that have kind of happened and built up this thing.
Jacob is mentioning on the sidebar United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3379, and again, keep in mind, if it's a resolution from the General Assembly, that means that it's not something that can be vetoed by the Security Council. But the General Assembly resolution essentially declared Zionism as being a form of racism, a resolution that was passed on the anniversary of the start of the Holocaust. And I know certainly in the United States there are a number of individuals who, mostly on the right wing, who have pointed to the number of resolutions that the Security Council has attempted to pass that criticizes Israel for its treatment of the Palestinians, almost all of which were blocked by the United States because of their veto power. But they've pointed to these resolutions as examples of anti-Israeli sentiment. We're almost out of time, so really quickly, just kind of going around the table, we'll start with Ms. McGinnis, and that way Mr. Lee will have a chance to maybe put something up on the sidebar. But Ms. McGinnis, in your opinion, given what we know about the United Nations, its strengths, its weaknesses, what do you think? Is it an organization that we should maintain in the international order, or do you think that American politicians like Ron Paul are correct and that we should basically remove ourselves from the United Nations and work to bring about its end? What do you think?
Personally, I think I'm a fan of mediation, of diplomatic relations, things like that. There are some instances where a third party is needed, and I feel like there have been a lot of times when the UN has kind of taken that role and they feel the need to help people. In terms of leaving the UN, I don't necessarily think that's a good idea. Not only does it kind of there are a lot of individuals that see it as a power thing, like the U.S. wants power, blah blah blah. But I see it as a thing. It kind of holds us accountable too. For instance, as I'd mentioned, when the UN it calls us out on things we do, it calls other individuals out. It's kind of like that check that we always say we want someone to kind of hold us accountable for what we do, and I feel like the UN does do that. Maybe not as efficiently as they should, and there are a lot of issues like imbalance, functionality issues, things like that that do need to be fixed over time. But I don't think that the U.S. should retreat or resign from the UN.
Mr. Lowe, what do you think?
The UN has long been a prevalent force in the global community, and I think that the U.S. relations in the UN is definitely something that's vital to the global community. Maybe not to our national security or our best interests, but it is something that we can definitely take away from. And personally, I think the U.S. has tried to use the UN for selfish political strategic moves in the past. And I don't know. I think the UN is in and of itself is a good force as far as preventing and containing conflicts. But maybe I don't know. It definitely needs some more checks and balances, as we mentioned before. As far as the funding goes, U.S. gives more than any country to the UN, and I think that that's definitely one of the many reasons that we should stay a part of the UN and stay active in it.
It looks like on the chat comments that Mr. Lee is suggesting that being involved in the United Nations for the United States, although he does have concerns, first of all, about the effectiveness of the United Nations, because if it's ineffective, then what's the point in participation? And also some concerns about the behavior of UN peacekeepers when they're in countries, and the fact that oftentimes, or that I shouldn't say often, but there have been instances in which UN peacekeepers have either been responsible for targeting individual civilians in the country, assaults, rapes, or maybe have not actually intervened in instances when they possibly should have. Well, looks like we've gone a little bit over time. So first of all, I want to thank all of my panelists. Again, Ms. McGinnis, Mr. Lowe, and Mr. Lee for their participation. Apologize again for the technical difficulties. And I would like to tell the people who are viewing at home that this is our penultimate session. So we have one more next week, which will either be on Tuesday or Thursday. And we will post more details for that on Facebook. Again, my name is Sean Williams, and we appreciate your viewing the podcast. Thank you.